In this lecture, we are going to see something called as constructor. So first of all, what is a constructor? A constructor is a special type of method that is used to initialize the object. It is used to initialize the object when it is created. And this method is automatically invoked by the framework when the object is created. So let's go back to our example, like where we had an employee class, where we had like set of attributes ID, name and salary. And then we had a couple of methods. So now let's see what happens when you don't initialize each of the data members separately. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create an object. So employee emp1 equal to new of employee. And then let's just print the values. So I have a simple like object reference which points to an object, and then I'm directly calling the print detail methods on top of it. So now let me run this code. So if you see here, the ID was initialized to null, the name attribute was initialized to null, and then the salary, which was a double type, was initialized to 0. Say suppose you want to initialize these values when the object itself is created. So then you can have the constructor. So in order to create the constructor, it is very simple. It should have this. So it should have the same name as the class name. So here our class name is employee. So the name of the constructor will be employee. And then, so first we are going to see something called as default constructor, which does not take any parameters. And a very important rule that you need to remember is the constructor does not return any values. So it does not have any return type also. So like what I mean to say is, right, you should not even mention void. So basically it does not have any return type and you should not mention anything. So here you can have all the initialization logic. So here I'm going to say default constructor, and then I'm going to say ID equal to initialize to null, name initialize to null, empty, and then the salary initialize to 0. So basically if you see here, I'm initializing each of the variables to an empty value. Okay, so now let's see what happens. So now let me just run this, the same code. So if you see here, like when we created the object, automatically the constructor got executed, and then if you see, right, like whatever values that we initialized, it got initialized. So if you see the console output, so here you will see that the ID is empty, the name is empty, and the salary is 0. So basically, like so default constructor, like it is used to initialize the member variables or the attributes. So now let's say at the time of the object creation itself, you want to initialize with certain values. So for that, you need to have something called as parameterized constructor. So basically what you can do is, right, constructors are overloaded. So we will be seeing the concept of overloading in a bit. So for a moment, like just assume that you can have multiple constructors within the same class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have another constructor. So obviously it doesn't have any return type, but here I'm going to pass the parameters. So I'm going to say string student ID, string student name, string double salary. So here I'm going to assign ID with the value of student ID. Similarly, name with the value of student name. Similarly, salary equal to student salary. So now what I'm going to do is When I create the object itself, I can pass the set of values and then have it initialized. So I'm going to pass the ID as 123 and then the name is Scott and the salary is 7,500. So since this is a double, we pass the double value. So now if I run this, so basically the parameterized constructor gets invoked and then the values are initialized with whatever parameters that we are passing. So let me put an SOP here to exactly see if the parameterized constructor is getting invoked. So if you see here, like I said new of employee with the parameters, now the parameterized constructor is invoked and then it is initialized with the values, and when I call the print details method, it basically prints the value that we pass through the constructor. So this is how you define a default constructor and a parameterized constructor. So you can have as many a parameterized constructor that you need. So the only thing is it should be overloaded. Basically the number of arguments should be different, the data type of the argument should be different, and the order in which the order in which the order of the data type should be different. So we'll be seeing about the rules with respect to overloading in a bit. So for now, just understand that the constructors can be overloaded. So now let's see few rules with respect to the constructors. So in this case, we have a default constructor and we had a parameterized constructor. So if I don't have any of them, so I'm just going to comment it. So when you don't have any constructor, the framework automatically inserts a default constructor and initializes all these data members to default value. So since string is a class by itself, and then that's the reason ID and name are initialized to null, and then salary is of double like a data type. So that is why it is initialized to 0. So that is how the initialization happens. So that is the reason it is all initialized to null and 0. And say suppose you have the parameterized constructor alone in your program. So when you have a parameterized constructor alone in your class, so when you create an instance, you have to definitely create the instance through the parameterized constructor. If you try to call the default constructor in this case, the framework does not insert the default constructor. So this is a very important rule that you remember. So if you have a parameterized constructor, the framework is not going to insert the default constructor. So the default constructor is invoked only when, the default constructor is inserted only when there are no constructors at all. So in this case, we have only parameterized constructor and we don't have any default constructor. So the framework is not going to introduce and it's going to complain. So the only way now you can do is passing the required parameters. So now I pass 123, Scott, and then 7500. So now let me just run this. So if you see here, it printed the values.